Okay, welcome to the Middle East session entitled Back to Winter in the Middle East with a question mark. And I'm Ji-Hyang Jang, head of the Middle East and North African program here at the Asan Institute. And I'm so glad to meet our old colleagues together finally. Okay, the Arab Spring or winter. Actually, 2.5 years ago, the Asan Institute held a huge Middle Eastern conference on the Arab Spring. And Michael and Dirk were there. And after the conference, Clem, Henry, and I gathered the papers and we edited a book entitled The Arab Spring, Will It Lead to Democratization? With question mark. And in the Plenum 2012, we had a session on the Arab Spring again. And last year, we had the Syrian crisis panel, which is one of the tragic consequences of the Arab Spring. And finally, today, we have a more pessimistic version of Arab Spring panel. So given the authoritarian regression in Egypt and the humanitarian crisis in Syria and the sectarian clashes in Iraq and even authoritarian leadership in Turkey, that we might face with the winter time in the Middle East. So today, as you already know, we have very distinguished and renowned scholars and experts on these issues. So we might want to hear from them about the Arab winter, but with two different angles, I think. So first, we are going to share 7 to 8 minutes about certain areas on specific, like detailed analysis about the Arab winter. So Dr. Salah will do that for us about Qatar, Saudi, and other GCC countries, and Michael will give us more, detailed analysis about Egypt and other Levant areas, and Dr. Elzein will do that for us on Syria and the Middle East, the U.S. Middle East foreign policy, and finally Dirk will give us, analysis about Libya and other North African countries. So we are going to hear about, the analytic, explanations or analysis about the Arab winter on certain areas first for 7 to 8 minutes, and then we are going to spend 2 or 3 minutes about any policy suggestions or policy implications, like how the international community or the US government or even the Korean government can do related to this winter theme. Last night in the welcoming dinner, Michael and I had a little chat about the US pivoting thing. So because he said that many people in the Middle East do not believe the US rebalancing and pivoting to Asia. And I told him that many Asians, many people in Northeast Asia also do not believe US really, refocusing, rebalancing toward Asia. So we can talk about the, policy suggestions issues too. So let me briefly introduce our panelists first. So Dr. Salah, my left side, he is a director of the Jazeera Center for Studies in Doha, Qatar right now. And he is a regular media commentator on issues related to the Middle East politics and also Sudan. And he used to teach at the universities in Johannesburg. And then we have Michael Hudson. Dr. Hudson is a director of the Middle East Institute and also professor at the National University of Singapore. And he served as director of Georgetown's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And he used to teach at the Georgetown University too. And also, he was a president of MISA, the Middle East Studies Association. And we have President Laipson, and she is a president and chief executive officer of the Stimson Center. And she serves as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also a member of the Secretary of State Foreign Affairs Policy Board. And she was a member of President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board. And finally, we have Dirk Vandewalle. He is a professor in the government department at Dartmouth College, and he is currently the field office director for the Carter Center missions in Libya. And he served as a political advisor to the UN on Libya during the pre-assessment period in the summer of 2011. All right, again, welcome to the Middle East session, and Dr. Salah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for this opportunity, and I'm very glad and honored to be part of this distinguished panel, and also honored to be present at this year's plenum. Just to start off, coming from a media organization, and media is always found guilty of being immersed into immediacy, that it look very much in history back or into the future. I'll try to defy that, not as much as the morning panelists were alluding to, but I'll try to do a little bit of looking back to history just to get an understanding of what is going on now and how to look into the future. The last century of the Middle East generally, since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, can be characterized as a century of disappointment, discontent, anger, and you can name a lot in that. And the reason being that the first 4 to 5 decades, for the most part of the region, were under colonialism. And people came out of that after the independence of most of the countries in that part of the region, but then the nation-states that followed failed to live up to the expectation of people in terms of achieving the level of development that people were aspiring to. But not only that, most of the governments of the region were guilty of corruption, lack of democracy, and all that. So all this created a sense of anger and frustration among the people. And I say this in general, although there are some exceptions here and there, but the overall view that the last 100 years of the region was characterized by this kind of discontent and disappointment. To add to that also, we have to remember that one of the key issues in the region is the Palestinian issue, the Arab-Israeli conflict around Palestine. And during the last 60 years, this has been a point of humiliation for the Arabs and Muslims in general. They saw all the injustices towards the Palestinians and the inability of the leaders in the region to achieve any just solution to the issue. And that the Palestinians also feel that they were let down by the international community. The Western powers generally side with Israel, and that also aggravated the sense of discontentment. Add to that also the interferences from Western powers in the region. You can name the Iraq War and a lot of other interferences, including supporting repressive regimes of the region were by Western powers. So overall, we have these decades of anger that aggravated. And we came out of that, with clear sense that there are forces within the region became very much focused trying to push for reform, for change, And there are other forces that want to maintain the status quo. And these, I mean, both sides, you can see that there are state actors involved in this side and state actors on the other side, and also non-state actors. So we have alliances being built up. Some are pushing for change, others trying to maintain the status quo. And I mean, the event that led to the wave of protest and uprisings in the Arab Spring is well known to everybody. I don't want to go into details about that. But this idea of having two powers struggling for the heart and soul of the region is very much growing right now. And we can see how the events going into the future will be influenced about that. I will just get back to this idea later before I conclude. Let me also turn to another element that's very important in understanding the geopolitics of the Middle East. And that is the continuous change in terms of political ideology. First, the region was dominated by socialism, and there are communists, and there are, so mainly left-leaning forces were dominant in the region. And then came the Pan-Arabism movement. I remember the days of Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and then came the Assad and Saddam Hussein, and all these subscribed to the idea of Pan-Arabism. And then later, from 1980s, we started to see the rise of political Islam. So the region was not stagnant in terms of political ideology. It kept changing from one ideology to another. This doesn't mean that there are no others, but these are the dominant ideologies. Of course, there are, I mean, other secular groups growing within the region. There are liberals also, but the dominant ones are these ones. And then we also have to think about the intertwined layers of conflict within the region. First, there is this conflict around the Palestinians, and that serves as a catalyst to, we can see the alignment of forces within the region when it comes to the Palestinian issue. And remember the days where we used to have this camp of the moderates and the camps of the resistant. Those are the forces pushing for solution to the Palestinian issue through negotiation. We used to call them the camp of moderates that include Egypt under Mubarak, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the others. While on the other side, you find at that time Libya under Gaddafi, Qatar, Iran, and some non-state actors like Hamas and all these. So this is one layer, but this is not the only conflict in the region. There is a sectarian layer to the conflict. The Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims. Sometimes we see this is flaring up, sometimes very quiet, but this conflict is there. And then the third conflict is this between these pro-change and anti-change forces. These layers of conflict normally decide or defines what happens in the region, depending on who is the leader at the time and what is the priority for this leader. And by leader, meaning the main actor within the region. And let me just delve into Saudi Arabia and Qatar playing these roles at different times. I mean, looking back 5-6 years ago, Qatar was very much in the driving seat. It was seen by many as an emerging force in the region. But remember, I mean, looking at these two countries, they both belong to the GCC, so they're part of the Gulf countries. They are both of the Sunni Islam sect. They're both very wealthy. They're both monarchies, so power is inherited within the families in this region. But there are differences between these two countries as well, I mean, in terms of their policies. the last 2 decades, Qatar tried to align itself with the forces that are pushing for reform and change in the region. Since the former Emir came to power in an unconventional way in 1995, he deposed his father, he came to power, and he started pushing for modernization agenda within his own country and also pushing for reform agenda in the Arab region. Saudi Arabia was very nervous about this. The wage power transferred to the former Emir was something for them. It was a bit of a surprise. They were not very comfortable with that. They were not comfortable with all the policies that pursued by Qatar under the former Emir. Now, again, the way the power transferred from the Emir to his son last year was another point of disagreement. Because that means here we have a country that's trying to set a new course in terms of succession in the region that is very much following the very conservative way of power transfer. That's anybody remains in power until passes away, somebody else inherits. So as a result, we have 2 countries follow different courses. And it became clear that Saudi Arabia started to see Qatar's policies as threatening to its national security and national interest. And that is when this disagreement became very clear when it comes to the events of the Arab Spring and supporting the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in some countries, and the Saudi Arabia supporting the counter-revolutionary forces in Egypt and other places. And looking forward to the future, one has to keep in mind, that these layers of conflict, and I'll conclude with this point, that because at some point Saudi Arabia defined that what is a threat to its national security and national interest is this wave of change. That's why Qatar became an enemy. But if tomorrow at some point Saudi Arabia said that this threat is from Iran, that will bring Qatar back to becoming an alliance, because in that case then we have the Sunni Muslims siding on one side against what's being perceived as. So this current situation is not the final one. It's probably gonna change according to who is being perceived by the dominant forces in the region as the immediate threat to their national interest.
That's very interesting. So if the Iran turns out to be a nuclear power, the nuclear militarization, then Saudi and Qatar will get together?
Most probably, yes, but remember also this issue of nuclear Iran, as much as it's seen as a threat by Western powers and by Israel, it's not the same level of threat is felt by the Arab countries within the region. They don't see that as much threat as the Israelis see it or the Western powers see it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Salah. So, Michael, it's your turn, so you can talk about.
Well, thank you very much, Ji-Hyang. It's always nice to be back at the Asan Institute.
Thank you.
And I can see from the title of the session that we're sort of expected to be pessimistic and gloomy, and I try to resist this. I don't like putting seasonal labels on things that are going on in the Middle East. There's an Arab Spring, then there's a warm summer, then there's a fall, and now is the winter of our discontent. But spring has to be right around the corner, and history repeats itself. But in fact, history, the question of history is actually a very fascinating theme for this whole conference. I was asked by Ji-Hyang to speak a little more narrowly than Dr. Salah, and to speak about developments in Egypt and the Mashriq, or the Levant, or in Arabic, Bilad al-Sham, or the Fertile Crescent. That means what is now Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Iraq, and so on. And as we look around this, what used to be called the beating heart of the Arab world, because this is where Arabism sort of originated in Damascus and Beirut, places like that. Wherever you look, there is turmoil and conflict, without exception. There are different levels of it. And I know this quite directly because I've been in Cairo recently observing how Field Marshal Sisi is trying to mount a counter-revolution against the Arab uprisings that brought down Mubarak on the model of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Good luck to Field Marshal Sisi. I think he has a long way to go before he reaches that level. But I would give him about 9 months, because I don't think what the Egyptians call the second revolution, please don't use the word coup. I was in Cairo recently and I made the mistake of using the word coup to describe the military's ouster of the Muslim Brotherhood-led government, and I was, fortunately it was a power outage, and so they couldn't throw things at me, but the idea of calling it a coup was extremely insulting to them. But in fact, I think it was a coup, but I don't think that stability will ensue. So if you're looking for historical models, will we see the emergence of the deep state, as the Turks call these things, in Egypt, as we had under Mubarak and Sadat? I don't think so. I think Egypt will remain quite turbulent, and I don't think that the military-led government, even though Sisi will win the election for sure, is going to be able to put a lid on what is an extremely problematic and depressing social and economic situation now in Egypt. And as you go across into the Mashriq, into Arab Asia, again, there's conflict everywhere. Dr. Salah has made, as he should, proper allusion to the Palestinian question. It is simmering, but there is talk, now that diplomacy has broken down again, of a possible third Palestinian intifada. Who knows? But clearly the pot is bubbling away slowly, even in this perennial conflict. We had in Singapore just last week a group from the American University of Beirut. We have a partnership with them. And they were telling us, among other things, that they're very worried that Lebanon itself is slipping more and more into the orbit or the fallout from the big war going on next door in Syria. So Lebanon is, as usual, on the edge, but it is getting really quite tricky. If you thought that Jordan is immune to all of these things because it's a monarchy, I think that's a bit oversimplified. And indeed, Jordan has experienced social and labor unrest. The king has lost a great deal of the traditional legitimacy that came from Transjordanian tribes to the Hashemite monarchy. And of course, Jordan is now hosting about 1 million Syrian refugees. It's not a happy situation, and Jordan is not a rich country that can simply throw money at conflicts. So that's not too great either. And as for, of course, the huge problem in Syria, I think all I can say, or by way of prediction, is that this is going to drag on for quite some time. But I cannot imagine, even if Assad posts a kind of cosmetic victory of a sort, that it will be a clean win, and that the idea of restoring the old sort of Assad dynasty in its previous form, I think, is unlikely. And if you wanted a slightly earlier example of what happens when you do regime change, this was before the Arab Spring as we know it happened, you just need to go down the Tigris and the Euphrates to Iraq and look at a country that is riven in so many different ways and is experiencing substantial violence every day, riven by ethnic and sectarian rivalries, international involvement, and so on and so on. And in all of this, of course, there are now transnational forces of a radical sort playing a certain role. Certainly within the Syrian opposition we see this. You're seeing it a bit in Lebanon. They're fearing it will happen in Jordan, and it certainly is already happening in Iraq. So let me just say a word, since this is about history, about historical analogies. History surely doesn't repeat itself. But let me give you sort of three historical models against which to juxtapose the kind of conflict that I've just described. The first is the Ottoman Turkish model. I have a historian colleague who likes to say that all of this conflict in this area that I've just described is really a continuation of what he likes to call the wars of Ottoman succession. After the collapse of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in the First World War, the question was, what do you do with these former Turkish territories? And clearly, whether you're looking at Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq, no clear, stable answer has really emerged. But please don't tell me that we should invoke the Turkish model, which has become fashionable until a couple of years ago. But now the Turkish model is regarded as somewhat tarnished, so that may not work. The second historical throwback that you might think of is this area in the late 1940s and 50s when there was a certain degree of parliamentary, pluralistic, I won't say democracy exactly, but there were parliamentary systems that had elections and had a good deal more political freedom of action than they subsequently had. Egypt had a parliament and parties, Syria had the same, Lebanon had the same, Iraq had the same. Are we going to see an evolution from the Arab uprisings of 2011 back in that direction? Well, it's going to be a long time coming. I don't see this quite around the corner. And so the third historical model, which in some ways I suppose seems to be the most relevant, is the model of the persistent authoritarian Arab deep state, the Mukhabarat state, which predominated throughout the region from the 60s up to very recently. And of course, many commentators have said when they talk about an Arab winter that that's what you're going back to, that the clock has turned, the calendar has come all the way around. The Saudis and the Gulf people make no bones about it. They say, yes, of course, we want a counter-revolution. We don't like these popular eruptions that have happened because they might happen to us. And indeed, they might. Remember, Bahrain still hasn't quite put down the uprising that happened there in that little monarchy. And Saudi Arabia suffers chronic unrest in the eastern regions, and so on and so on. Can the deep state as we knew it, the Mubarak state, the Hafez al-Assad state, the Muammar Gaddafi state, the Ali Abdullah Salah in Yemen state, reappear? Well, of all of the models, I suppose this is the one that you might think is the truest. I don't think so myself. I don't think this can happen. I don't think you can go back to the kind of complacent, corrupt system that you had before. And there are reasons for that. The main reason, I think, is, as many commentators have said, the people in the Arab world have lost their fear of the all-oppressive nizam, le pouvoir, the system that nobody thought that they could do anything about. Suddenly they discovered they could. Well, it hasn't gone well, but I think that the genie is out of the bottle on this one. So when we say that we learn from history, we can agree with that, but whether history will exactly repeat itself in these cases, I think is a little unlikely.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, it sounds much more optimistic than our panel description, I think. Okay, Elzein, please.
Thank you. Well, let me associate myself with Michael's last point. I think what we are being is strategic realists, and we are accepting that some of the changes that have happened bottom up, spontaneously, authentically in the Arab world are still one of the dynamics of the relationship between society and state. At the 3-year mark of the Arab uprisings, it's still too early to try to decide how will the history books treat this period. So I think it's impractical to be too pessimistic right now because these are processes of change that take longer to play out. I was asked to talk about Syria and Middle East, U.S. policy in the Middle East. So now I'll sort of bounce between broad historical judgments and more tactical understanding of the situation we face today. But let me just start on Syria by invoking the 20th anniversary of Rwanda. So I think the tragedy that we feel this spring is, after some very solemn references to, the never again experience of the international community after Rwanda, in fact, the international community has not figured out any successful tools other than military force to change the course of history when a society is in a period of self-destruction or has some suicidal impulse, as we have seen in a number of countries. So to stop the atrocities, to prevent them from happening, the international community really has demonstrated that for all the responsibility to protect, civilian protection, we've created a whole new industry of theory and doctrine about the role of the responsibility of the international community. But Syria is a great tragedy that demonstrates that we really don't have new tools in our toolbox. The decision of the Obama administration to not use military force in Syria is something that people are struggling with. Certainly in the Arab world, there's been a lot of criticism that we didn't play the role that the superpower is supposed to play. I personally was completely comfortable and understanding of the president's position, that after Iraq and Afghanistan, he made a very deep conviction based on principle to not be drawn into conflicts in ways that would once again expose the United States to open-ended military obligations that don't necessarily solve the problem at hand. So, nobody likes our Syria policy right now, including, I would say, the people who make the policy. There are no easy, available solutions, and the best we are doing on Syria is trying to guide international efforts. The United States is still the largest single provider of humanitarian assistance. Some of that is done so discreetly because we are trying to reach populations in very dangerous places, so we are not even talking publicly about some of the assistance that we are managing with great creativity and tenacity to get to Syrians in need. But that is literally just relief. It is not anything related to long-term development, reconstruction, rehabilitation, stabilization, etc. It is really just first-order access to basic human services. The political process that we supported, led by the United Nations, has essentially come to an end. The UN will never have an interest in saying it's completely over, but it has not produced any results. The regime is defiant and complacent. President Assad is on the verge of being reelected. The opposition is in disarray, even if they are getting incrementally better equipment to try to even the battlefield. The Kurdish political opposition has perhaps a slightly better feeling that they are moving into self-governance. Whether the Iraqi Kurds like that, whether the Turks like that, that's another matter. But I do find it ironic that in the second term of the Obama administration, with Susan Rice as the National Security Advisor and Samantha Power as our ambassador to the UN, two very strong activists for intervention in these kinds of situations, that instead they are following the president's instructions that we not push for too activist a position on Syria. So even when there's a personnel alignment that would favor a more activist American role, the president, I think, has set the policy parameters very strongly. I think there is worry now that whatever we are trying to do in Syria is adversely affected by the downturn in U.S.-Russian relations because of Ukraine. It is perhaps inhibited by the Iran nuclear talks, where we don't want to be too confrontational with Iran at this time of very important negotiations. So I think there's a very uncomfortable conversation that happens a little bit on the margins of whether U.S. policy and, in fact, international policy has to accommodate itself more to the survival of Assad, and whether there is a different policy track to take that tries to reestablish some modus vivendi between the Syrian opposition and a regime that simply is not facing any imminent threat of being ousted. In the long run, one would hope, the theory should tell us that the Syrian peoples will have some impact on whether Assad survives or not. But the immediate, I would say at least for the next year, we don't really face a high likelihood of important political change in Damascus. Let me just say a few words about the larger U.S. policy. President Obama started out with this very grand Cairo speech to the Arab world that set really a very inspiring agenda for working together as partners in a period of transition and change that was very much to be led by Arabs, different in different cultural circumstances, but very much identifying with some universal values, ideals of greater transparency, the role of the individual, citizens' rights, etc., working to preserve the environment more successfully together, embracing the fruits of better education systems, etc. When we look back at that speech, it's very poignant of how little of that is really operational today, even though I think that some of the idealistic objectives it stated are still meaningful to people in government. But there's no doubt that U.S. influence in the region is in decline, partly by global shifts in power, a redistribution of power among nation states, and partly by, paradoxically, the outcome of the Arab Spring, that the Arab Spring should have been a more favorable alignment between American interests and Arab interests, but in a strange way it has turned out differently, that the United States has to be very, very careful about how we engage with civil society now in the Arab world, of whether there is enough political and social acceptance of an American role. I would say that Tunisia and Libya, which Dirk will talk about, may be the exceptions where there's enthusiasm for an American role. But in so many other parts of the Arab world, we have to accept that our contribution of democratic ideals and principles to the Arab world happened before the Arab Spring. And now the Arab Spring is a chance for these societies to interpret it in their own way. But when you think of the programmatic activity that the United States has been known for in the last couple of decades of working with all kinds of civil society organizations, women's groups, educational exchanges, etc., all of that has to be a little bit recalibrated right now as U.S. influence in the region has shifted. Our aid relationships in a time of budget austerity are still important for some countries, but generally not sufficient to make a huge difference. And when we see the very wealthy Gulf Arabs providing budget support to Arab states with no conditions, we see now an imbalance in the leverage that the donor countries of the West have. We have less leverage now to persuade an Egyptian government that signing an IMF agreement is in their interest, for example, when they are getting an infusion to the tunes of billions of dollars from their Gulf brothers and cousins with absolutely no requirements for economic policy reform. So U.S. influence in that sphere has also been reduced. In terms of our military presence, here again, somewhat ironically, I think there is still a very strong demand for an American security presence in the region, particularly in the Gulf. So strangely, in an era of, in theory, democratization, an end of America's wars in the region, etc., perhaps our security relationships are more stable and secure than some of our civilian relationships. This is something we might disagree on, but that's how it looks to me. That we are reassuring our friends in the Arab world, particularly in the Gulf, that we will not reduce our presence in the Gulf in particular, even while we are trying to expand it somewhat in East Asia, that there have been messages from the Secretary of Defense of reassurance to the Gulf, and this is particularly in the environment of us negotiating with Iran, where the Gulf Arabs need some reassurance that negotiations with Iran will not happen entirely at their expense, and that we still see that they have national security requirements in which the U.S. is an important actor. So I wanted to just call to your attention when people try to think about how might we change U.S. policy in the region, an interesting piece by Colin Kahl and Mark Lynch on a progressive engagement. How do we recalibrate something that has a strong security component to it but has not completely abandoned democracy promotion in the Arab world? Can we find a way to re-engage on the big questions of greater political openness and representation? So I thought I'd leave that with you. And again, let's just widen our frame a little bit and think more historically in terms of broad historic periods. We are in a period of transition in the region that the U.S. has, like any other outside actor, has to adapt to. It is a post-authoritarian moment for many, not all of the states of the Arab world. We are witnessing the rise of the Gulf as perhaps the strongest power center in the Arab world, which means that the Gulf countries have influence over the Mediterranean Arab countries in ways they've not had in the past. And we see indisputably a changing role for outside actors in the region, a more modest role, a role that defers to the wishes of the countries in the region, and that to me will have some long-term historical consequence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Laipson. So Dirk, this is
Thank
your
you,
turn.
Ji-Hyang, and thank you to the Asan Institute. We've had, as you said, over 3 or 4 years, a number of meetings here that I think have been very productive at setting out some of the issues related to the Arab Spring. And Ji-Hyang had asked me to talk about Libya and North Africa, and I'm going to talk primarily about Tunisia and Libya. I'll be glad to go back to Morocco and Algeria during the question and answer session. Morocco is actually a very interesting example of a country that has made a number of proactive decisions to avoid the kind of problems that some of the other Arab Spring countries have run into, that really reach all the way back to the reconciliation that was started after Hassan II died in Morocco. The big question, of course, is why haven't we seen any real trouble in Algeria, which is known for its activism, that has seen the civil war, this 10-year civil war a while back, and there's all kinds of very interesting scenarios there in order to explain that, one of them being that this country is still so traumatized by what has happened that neither side is really willing to come to a confrontation again, although my hunch is this will probably come back later on in a few years. Let me talk primarily about Tunisia and Libya. And two very, very interesting cases. Tunisia, I think, somewhat a modified success, I would call it. Remember that this is where the Arab Spring started in December 2010. All kinds of movements to get rid of the Ben Ali regime, and a country that then, against a very tight deadline, a timeline that it didn't really meet, decided to create a constituent assembly, then write a constitution, and eventually did so. And I was in Tunis the day that they adopted that new constitution. It was really an electrifying moment when you saw all the political factions, whether they were Islamists or non-Islamists, some of the secularists, some of the old-time parties, the representatives really stand up in an ovation for each other that they had passed this very important framework for Tunisia. And so the question, of course, and it goes back to what some of the other panelists have said, what made Tunisia to some extent a modified success. It's not a total success, but at least arguably a modified success. And I think here history to some extent is very important. Remember, this is a country with a very strong state tradition that goes back, pre-Bourguiba even, think of the Neo-Destour and so on, where a lot of the bureaucratization, the institutions of the modern state, the rule of law were canalized, were institutionalized, and certainly if you looked at some of the people and how some of the processes, and we followed this very, very closely with the Carter Center as we were watching the move toward the elections, how this kind of the traditional bureaucratization, these channels really became important again, were renewed, and it was always interesting to me to see the kind of people and their backgrounds as they were participating in some of these negotiations that allowed somebody like Ranouchi, very, very different in outlook, very different in terms of what he thought a legal precept should be in Tunisia, come to terms and come to compromise with people certainly that he never could have compromised during the Ben Ali period. So Tunisia, a relative success. Libya, of course, is a whole different ball game. And Libya, yes, first of all, Gaddafi was removed, but Libya remains almost 3 years after the revolution took place, or at least the Libyans call it a revolution, very much a fragile state. I would not call Libya a failed state necessarily, because there is a sense of identity, there is a sense of, this is particularly Libya. But nevertheless, certainly lots and lots of problems as we move forward. And initially, after the revolution started in Libya, there was an enormous amount of initial enthusiasm for what had happened. And there was enthusiasm. A lot of it, I think, was artificially created internationally, but there certainly was some enthusiasm within Libya as well. And it really had to do with what Mike referred to as the deep state, that there were lots of people, including myself, that thought that in Libya, because it really had had no institutionalization under Gaddafi, no real bureaucracy except some very bad bureaucracy, that this deep state would need to be dismantled. That there wasn't the kind of army, for example, that you had in Egypt. These were brigades, basically, loyal to family members of the Gaddafi clan, etc., but no real unified institutions that could represent the Mukhabarat state, as Mike termed it. I think in the end, we misanalyzed that, because the deep state in an oil state like Libya actually had a lot more to do with patronage rather than with coercion. And as I'll tell you in a minute, that patronage really came back. And of course, that initial enthusiasm was pushed forward by the national elections in July 2012, which by all observers were fair, transparent, in a highly accountable fashion. And so it was hoped that this would be able, that the Libyans would be able to pick up from there and really develop a clearly articulated political system. And that, of course, didn't happen. And it didn't happen because it was already very clear. As a matter of fact, when I was working for the UN, I, along with some other people, had really argued very early on that Libya should not have had the elections very early on, or at least not within a year after the revolution, in part because the institutional framework around it, that you need to make institutions work to make sure that people understand what the rules of the game were in a democratic system, simply weren't there. And so that it would have been a lot better to create consensus and to build institutions before you actually went to elections. But of course, this was in a sense set aside, and the international community, pushed to some extent by UNSMIL, the UN special mission in Libya, moved forward with the elections. It was very clear at the time of the elections that these were elections that, in a sense, had very little meaning. There were no real political platforms. There were no real political parties. It was very clear also, not surprisingly, after 42 years of Gaddafi, that there was no clear understanding of what a political system really meant, what democracy, even moving toward democracy, really meant. And so what happened was that the General National Congress, the GNC, which is Libya's parliament, in a sense, was the embodiment of that political institutionalization of Libya, if you want to. But at the same time, it had no traction whatsoever. And so the institution itself became hollowed out and became valued not for what it could deliver as a modern political institution, representing the people of Libya, but really for what it could deliver. And so here the deep state, in a sense, re-emerged, but it re-emerged not in the sense of the Mukhabarat state that Mike talked about, the army in Libya, but it re-emerged through the patronage. And so the GNC became valued for what it could deliver. It's very interesting. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at the kind of patronage that the GNC has lavished on the Libyan people. It's equal, if not more, than what Gaddafi ever lavished during his own reign. So again, obviously a major problem. So you had a bifurcation that was taking place. You have a political system, but on the other hand, the political system may not mean an enormous amount. And it's hoped, of course, Libya is moving, as you know, is moving forward. As we sit here, the Constituent Assembly is meeting in Al-Baida, which is historically chosen because there's the link there with the monarchy, the kind of the national imagination, of course. But there are two major problems that remain. as I'll tell you in my concluding remarks, will take some time to resolve. And the two problems are, first of all, that the state, those that represent the state in Libya, still do not have the old Weberian monopoly of violence. That is, that you have a large number of militias that can almost at will still offset whatever those representing the state want to do. And then the second problem is really one more of national identity. It's the issue of federalism that has re-emerged in a sense, not so much from an economic or financial point of view, but really from almost a cultural, symbolic point of view, particularly in the eastern parts of the country. So, in a sense, Libya, again, is moving forward. These Constitutional Assembly people are meeting, 60 representatives, 20 from each of the provinces. But again, it's not very clear yet what they will represent and what eventually that constitution that is going to be drafted by this Constitutional Assembly will really look like. Nevertheless, as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that the new parliament, and they've deliberately now renamed it. They will no longer call it an assembly, they will call it the parliament, again for symbolic reasons, that this new assembly will now actually come to represent more of a real political system. We've started to see some development of political parties, we've actually started to see some political platforms and so on, all things we didn't see before. There's kind of three main points I want to make before I conclude. And that is, as we think about the Arab Spring, the first thing, and Ellen made a reference to this as well, the first thing to say is that we really need to have some patience. These are systems, particularly if you think about Libya, where really there was nothing whatsoever, that almost any state institution had been destroyed by the Gaddafi regime, and to create under those kinds of circumstances a modern functioning state takes an enormous amount of time. If you think, for example, that one of the major challenges of Libya is to create a national army, a truly national unified army, and if you know that creating a modern army, if you take kind of the progression through normal promotions and so on that you're talking about at the earliest 15 to 20 years to make that possible, we're really talking probably about a generation before a country like Libya will really, if it indeed moves toward becoming a real state. The second point is really a point about history that both Mike and Ellen referred to, and that is that in a sense it will pay, and this really blends over a little bit, Ji-Hyang, into what the recommendations will be that you'll ask us to make, but that in a sense we should be a little more sensitive to the kind of institutionalization that we find in some of these countries, and rather than try to build a consensus, rather than move automatically toward what we feel are the right way to move forward, which is usually elections. Elections can come too early in certain countries, and I would argue certainly that was the case in Libya. And then the third point I would like to make is that the one thing that we've not really talked about here, but which has emerged now in North African politics very, very vividly in all four of the countries, all across the region, and that is the role that the Islamists will play in the political systems. And it's very clear that Islam is here to stay. What is not very clear yet is what kind of Islam we'll see, the kind of tendencies within Islam that will actually win out in the long run, but certainly that will be a very important dimension. My final concluding comment would be that we've now started to see in the region, in North Africa, polling for the first time, really serious polling in Libya and in Algeria to some extent. Certainly we had some a little bit before in Tunisia, but again renewed after the war. And if one of the questions that they always ask is of citizens, essentially, are you better off now than you were when the Arab Spring started? And so in terms of the question, Arab Spring versus Arab Winter again, I think most of the local population, and particularly the younger population, would argue that it's still very much a moment of the Arab Spring and not a return to the Arab Winter. So on that more positive note, back to you, Ji-Hyang.
Thank you so much. I mean, we feel much better, right? I mean, we have more optimistic and patient needed, demand from the Arab world, I think. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes, but as I told you before, we will spend about, say, 8 minutes for each policy suggestions, but I know that Ellen and Dirk already did it, but still, like, do you have any like a policy recommendation for the international community or even the European Union or the U.S. government and for the middle powers or the GCC countries? I mean, you name it, those important players in the region, in specific and in the world in general. So each of you have 1 or 2 minutes for the policy suggestions, and then we will gather some questions from the floor. So Dr. Salah, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I would also support the sense of optimism as coming from that region. I think what is started is bound to continue. It might be difficult transition, it might be turbulent, but to go back to the repressive regimes, I don't think that is going to happen in the region. I have 2 points for policy suggestions. One is that if we look back at how the Arab Spring started, it was about socio-economic issues, mainly that driven the youth to go to the streets. And very soon after the dictators depart, then we have the more organized political parties came and started all this political game for trying to win. And as far as up to now, it is more about politics, not about policies. So my suggestion would be if the international community and all the international players will want to help stabilize that region, is to try to refocus debate and discussion about policy issues to address the socio-economic situations of this. And coming from that region, I know most of our political parties don't have much to offer in this regard. I mean, I come from a country over 60 years old because it's just about, politics, about who's going to be sitting there. It's not about offering social, economic, and alternative addresses these chronic issues about the country. So that is one area. Secondly, I think this is, from what I see, the United States, the Western powers, or the Western Europe, they have a history of animosity with most of the emerging players, let's say, in the region. Let us not forget that they've been in alliance with Hosni Mubarak and Ben Ali's and all this. The relationship between the Western Europe and the United States with the Islamists who are now leading in most of these countries is not that great. But this opened the opportunity for other forces, I think, to come in and to try to help. Because remember, the United States policies in the region is always connected with the protection of Israel. And a lot of people don't trust the United States as an honest player to come in because they always think about its alliance with Israel, while the others might be more welcome. And I think this is an opportunity for other players to come in and to try to help. And there is an opportunity to do this for the sake of stability in the region that contribute to the peace and stability of the whole world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salah. Michael?
It's a big subject.
I know.
Let me say, first of all, I think that if in fact we are entering a more multipolar global world, as far as the Middle East is concerned, that could be actually a very good thing. And I think it's not at all a bad idea to recommend that the United States get out of trying to dominate the Palestinian-Israeli diplomacy for reasons that are quite obvious. It doesn't work and it's unbalanced and all that. But only if the rest of the world would wake up and come together and exert some serious pressure, not just on the question of Palestine and Israel, but on all the other things. There is an interesting doctrine recently in international law called responsibility to protect. Maybe I've just missed it, but where is the international community on Syria? Can't something more be done to alleviate a humanitarian problem like we have not seen in half a century or more? I don't know. But I think that leads me to suppose that if as we incessantly hear down in Singapore, and maybe you hear it here, that Asia is rising. Well, if Asia is rising, why doesn't it rise to the occasion in the Middle East and exert some positive political and diplomatic influence to deal with some of these issues? It's all very well for China to sit back and free ride, let the Russians do the dirty work for them, and they just sit there. Why don't they do something positive? And why can't the international powers come together, at least on some issues? Very hard now, as was mentioned, between the United States and Russia, but still. And then finally, as long as I'm condemning people right and left, I think that the leadership across the board in the Arab world has been abysmal, and with few, if any, exceptions. But I think in particular the role of the Gulf states has been particularly bad. They were, to put it kindly, they were careless in the way they funded radical extremist Islamist opposition groups. They were short-sighted to think that they can roll back history. And now they're mad at the United States. They're afraid that the United States might actually tilt to Asia. Asia, they're worried the United States is not going to tilt to Asia. But in any case, I think there's been a stunning failure of leadership in the region all around.
I mean, speaking of the international community, Korea actually doing some contribution to the meeting of the Friends of Syria. I mean, in different ways. So we do some. Ellen?
Well, I thought I'd focus on two issues that are a little more tactical, perhaps, than... one is, I really do think that the United States has to work more carefully with the Gulf countries that are donors to Egypt, North Africa, etc., to really communicate better about what are sustainable economic strategies for the Arab countries that are not the oil-rich countries. So, I mean, for the stability of the region, for the self-interest of the Arab donors, I think that we just have to find more common ground between more traditional Western donors and these Gulf Arab donors, because I think that what they're doing, as Michael said in a slightly different reference, are really quite short-sighted. They sort of buy peace in 6-month or 12-month increments. They don't really see long-term strategies and there's no question that stabilizing the economies of the Arab transition countries is perhaps the single most important thing that the outside world can do to make these transitions more peaceful, if possible. So look for the complementarities, work with the Gulf donors. The second is something that where maybe Asians, particularly Southeast Asian countries with large Muslim communities, can play a role, and that is to work a little bit on these citizenship and identity issues. I think there's a great fear that in the Arab Levant, with the outmigration of Christians and minority groups, that the Middle East is losing what was always such an intrinsic part of its identity and part of its charm, that the Middle East had naturally a kind of multiculturalism to it because of its profound history and the different civilizations that coexisted, etc. We're in a moment between sectarianism, new national identities that are too monocultural of losing that, and whether Arab societies can learn from other Muslim societies about more tolerance and diversity. That is something that I think comes naturally to Americans, but if we are not the right messenger right now, maybe they can hear it from other societies as well.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So, Dirk, do you...
Yeah, two very quick points, and it fits in a bit with what Ellen said. And I say this more as having been on the ground in Libya and Tunisia over the last 2.5 years. But it seems to me that particularly in terms of soft power, there's a lot that the United States could do in the region. This is a region that is badly starved of expertise, expertise running all the way from purely educational ventures all the way into political party systems, you name it. They're very incredibly eager for it. Usually it gets delivered to them with some conditions attached that they don't like. So there's lots there that can be worked out, I think, and where particularly the United States would benefit. But then on the other hand, and this is the second point, I think a lot of this, particularly in North Africa, and I only speak really for North Africa here, that really needs to be done in a multilateral setting. It's very clear that particularly in Libya, there is a great sensitivity to just being seen as being cozied up too close to the United States. And so that a lot of these initiatives are going to have to be worked out with the European Union. Some of that has already happened on the terrorist issues, the smuggling issues, and so, but it's really going to have to go beyond that in terms of aid packages, again, soft power expertise and so on being brought on into the region.
All right. I mean, it's very interesting discussion. Just because the United States is not really a right messenger right now. I mean, for the Middle East and for the Arab world. So the window of opportunity is wide open for the international community in general, and the middle powers in specific, to provide state building, nation building, and institutionalization project, but with some conditions. I mean, we don't need, no condition, just massive aid. Okay, so we have about 7 or 8 minutes, so the floor is open. So if there's any questions, please identify yourself first, and let me collect some questions from the floor. Okay, I saw 2 gentlemen over there.
I'm Bob Einhorn. Is this on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Iran factor in the region. Iran is pursuing a 2-track kind of approach. On the one hand, it's clearly making trouble in Syria. It's supporting Hezbollah. It's sending arms to Hamas. It's a troublemaker. And a certain segment of the Iranian regime is seen as responsible for that. On the other hand, you have President Rouhani and his close advisors sort of reaching out. Javad Zarif is traveling all around the region trying to restore relationships that were damaged over the years. Which faction is going to win out? What is the reaction of the Gulf Arabs in particular, but also the Arab world in general, to what Iran is doing in the world, and to what extent is that affected by the outcome of the nuclear negotiations?
Okay, thank you so much. So, Jonathan, we will have your question too.
John Chow from the University of Macau. I'd just like to ask the panelists perhaps to comment on the resurgence of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There was a video showing the leadership I believe earlier this week or last week, and just checking the news, there are massive airstrikes now. But perhaps if you could comment a bit on what you believe is accounting for the resurgence of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and how receptive, given that it seems to be growing again, what are the factors that account for its attractiveness, perhaps, in recruitment?
Okay, we have about 5 minutes, and we have very difficult 2 questions. The first one is about Iranian, 2-track strategy. Like we have moderate Hassani faction here, and more ultra hardliner under the Supreme Leader. So we have Iran question, and the second question is about the emergence of Al-Qaeda in the Gulf region. So anybody wants to volunteer?
Well, I'll take a crack at it. I actually think Syria is probably the most important thing Iran could do if it wants to signal to the rest of the Arab world that it is not, that its hegemonic ambitions never take into account Arab interests. I think most of the Arab states are going to be permanently worried about Iran, whether the nuclear negotiations succeed or fail. Because if the negotiations fail and Iran moves faster to a nuclear in defiance, Iran then accelerates its nuclear activities, the Arab side loses. But they also lose if the negotiations succeed. because they're permanently worried about Iran as the natural regional power, the country that will become the darling of the West economically, etc. But my sense is that the Zarif and the sort of softer Iranians in power today have been trying to signal that they could be flexible on Syria. For example, by saying that, you know, they're interested in stability in Syria, but it's not necessary. It could happen with some change at the top. Mm-hmm. So they could envision a Syrian government without Assad, I think. I think that's what they're signaling. But they've not been, you know, from their perspective, they've not been given an opportunity to be real players in a diplomatic process. And the U.S., I think, has been very ambivalent about whether you want to acknowledge Iran as one of the stakeholders in the future of Syria, or do we just see them on the wrong side of the ledger? So if the Iranians could figure out a way to acknowledge the Arabs' deep worry about the future of Syria, I think that might begin to shift. We do hear signs from some of the Gulf states, oh no, we're going to figure out a modus vivendi with Iran. Don't worry, we know how to, we've lived together for all these centuries, we'll figure it out. But when they come to the United States and to the outside world, it's clear that it's very divisive. But in terms of power within Iran, I still worry that the new team may not be the prevailing political factor forever. They could suffer setbacks, and they could overplay their hand. And so I don't think the jury is out. The jury's not in yet on which side is going to prevail. Why don't I stop there if others have other comments on?
Do you want to add something
just
on Iran?
one sentence about Iran. I think also in the Arab countries, there's also growing awareness that Iran is changing from within. I mean, this change of demographies and the shift was focused on more internal issues rather than focusing on the outside. So overall, there's a sense of, okay, Iran in the future will not bring Ahmadinejad again or somebody like Ahmadinejad. I mean, Rouhani might have his chance, somebody else might come, so it's going along that way. It's more moderate than before. But about Al-Qaeda, quickly,
Okay.
Well, Al-Qaeda may resurface every now and then, but we have to remember that Al-Qaeda always flourishes where there is a failing or a weak state. That happened in many places in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, moved to Mali, to those places, and where there are some Western interest for them to target. The general public in the Arab world is not supportive of Al-Qaeda. And the Arab Spring, actually, it went against that momentum of resorting to violence. And never happened in the Arab world that there's any public show of support to Al-Qaeda anywhere, except I think one incident happened in Yemen that was some figures of Al-Qaeda seen publicly addressing people. It was because of tribal kind of connections of those leaders. So Al-Qaeda may surface in the Arab world, in Africa, in some places, wherever there is a weakened state, and some Western interest, especially United States interest for them to target, they will go for it.
Okay, Dirk.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up very quickly. I mean, certainly one of the weak places has been Libya, and after the Gaddafi regime fell, the unsecured borders, the enormous amount of weaponry that was in Libya has served as, a feeding station almost for lots of these radical movements, including Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is now in Libya. Undefended borders, the United States and the European Union have tried very valiantly to make an inroad against that. It's an enormous problem, obviously, but in terms of attractiveness, some of these are really convinced ideologues, I think, but also if you think to people like Mukhtar Belmokhtar and so on, a lot of these are simply bandits also. There's a lot of criminality associated with it as well. So there's a whole range of ideological attractions for these movements.
Okay, Michael, do you want to add something on Iran or Al-Qaeda issue?
I think all the most important points have been made. I just say, I think with respect to Iran, it's always going to be a sort of a cooperative, competitive kind of relationship. The United States is not going to become an ally of Iran or vice versa. But I think the Saudis and the Gulf people do have genuine security concerns, not so much about Syria, but about closer to home. And they do worry about Iranian manipulation of sectarian feelings in the Gulf itself, and of course in these other kind of empty spaces that have opened up across eastern Syria and western Iraq and in southern Yemen and in Libya and who knows where else. And I think it's a good point that there's a kind of a vacuum that these Al-Qaeda people can fill. So in a way, you're playing classical international politics. You'll make a deal with Iran in order to avoid the possibility of a shooting war involving the U.S. and Israel versus Iran over an Iran that has really gone nuclear. You don't want that. But at the same time, it would be a little naive, I think, to suppose that Iran is not going to use its natural preponderance and so forth to try and exert power and influence in the region, with or without a nuclear weapon. And the Gulf people, I think, are particularly upset because they do feel that the Americans are losing interest.
Yeah.
Despite everything that Susan Rice and Obama say, they still worry, I think. And where does that leave them? It leaves them, not getting much sleep at night.
One last thought. A unified GCC, if the Gulf countries really got their act together and took a more unified stance on issues, that would probably be the most natural counterbalance to Iranian power. But when the Gulf is divided over Ikhwan or other issues, it does still make Iran look like the strongest country in the region.
Okay, so please join me thanking to our distinguished panelists for today. Thank you.